Alright, it's time for the review a good amount of you guys have been waiting for. I guess I'm sort of becoming like a platformer guy around these parts, so of course I would eventually come to the Ratchet & Clank series. Now I've said this before, but the Spyro the Dragon games were some of my favorite games as a kid. For a good chunk of my childhood, these games were purely my life. Yeah, looking back now, they have a few issues, like screw you Bentley, but otherwise they're excellent games. And then when Sony entered the new generation with the PS2, Insomniac basically threw away the Spyro license and decided to do something totally new. Still pretty bitter about that whole Spyro ordeal, but I'll be talking about PS2 era Spyro later on. Of course, now we're going to talk about Insomniac's second baby that debuted in 2002, Ratchet & Clank. It's a series that's 11 years old and 11 games strong. And yes, I will try giving a nice good look at all of them. And some of you guys may be saying, wait a minute, wasn't there another one that was released on mobile phones? Nah, I don't know what you're talking about. That game doesn't exist. It's all fake. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. It's also the perfect time to start talking about the series too, since they actually just recently announced a movie, which took me completely off guard. Now I'll be cutting these 11 games into sessions of 3, so naturally we have to start off with the PS2 trilogy. So now to finally cut to the chase, let's start with the game that started it all, the original Ratchet & Clank.
It's Quarktastic!
The story takes place many years into the future, somewhere in the 5000s. It starts off on planet Veldin, home to the Lombax, Ratchet, who's working on his spaceship. Now, what's a Lombax? I don't know, it's like a cat-rabbit hybrid thing, but let's be real here, is it any weirder than a bandicoot, hedgehog, or Tasmanian tiger? Not really. Then on planet Quartu, a robot assembly line malfunctions and pops out the teeny tiny robot that turns out to be Clank. And after watching some sort of video on an infobot, it's chased off the planet via a spaceship and shot down back on Veldin. Oh, the convenience! Ratchet checks out the incident, and once Clank regains consciousness, he shows off the infobot which shows Chairman Drek, a blarg who explains his home planet is no longer habitable due to overpopulation and pollution. So to resolve that, he wants to build a new one for his race by extracting parts of other planets. The little nugget though that he chooses to leave out of all this is that the side effect is that the planet will get destroyed in the process. So he of course tries to put on a whole nice guy facade, but he's a real danger to the galaxy and it's up to a furry and a robot to save the day. Only the best. Now that's the main premise, but there's actually a lot more that you do on your adventure. Like you meet up with the quote-unquote superhero Captain Quark and ask for help, even though he has some different motives of his own. There's Skid McMarks, who gives you a hoverboard to enter in a race. And then of course there's the Janitor, who's in almost every game in the series and just plenty more. For a platformer, this has some of the most character interaction and story progression I have ever seen. Because you have a wide array of different planets that you explore and you visit them very frequently, and each planet has its own story. So for an adventure that's only about like 7 hours long, it's non-stop action and story, and it's actually really entertaining. It mixes together an interesting galaxy with a large cast of quirky characters with an antagonist that you actually kind of want to see be served a slice of wrenched justice. And there's even a subplot where Ratchet and Clank start hating each other, only to eventually realize the true magic of friendship. It's certainly a bit of a step up from a purple dragon saving the day 3 different times. Now, Ratchet & Clank is really only a platformer in name only. There is some basic platforming from time to time, but it's mostly an action-adventure game where you explore all these different planets and take advantage of a huge arsenal of weapons and gadgets that you have at your disposal. The series is very well known for its wacky and over-the-top weapons, but here it's actually really tame. You have your standard pistol, a rocket launcher, a flamethrower, a glove that throws bombs, a beam that transforms enemies into chickens. You know, typical stuff. And the majority of these weapons you have access to at the Gadgetron vendors spread across the planets, that you can purchase thanks to the bolts that you can find. And there are literally bolts all over the place in the entire galaxy. And even more boxes filled with even more bolts. Those who aren't familiar with the series won't really get when I say this, but collecting bolts is just a necessity, and not really just for getting new stuff. I am pretty much convinced that our subconscious forces us to break every single box that comes in our path because you literally cannot help yourself. I know I can't, I'm not the only one, it's just insanely addicting collecting these things. Then there's 16 weapons in total that you unlock as you play through the game, and honestly, these ones really aren't all that special. This is honestly probably one of the weakest weapon lineups in the entire series. There's the Walloper that does strong close combat punches, the Visibomb gun that sends out remote control missiles, and there is the Suck Cannon, which, despite its amazing name, I've never found useful outside of the final boss. I end up only playing through the game the first time through with 4 weapons, and I've never run into any problems. Part of me not caring is because there's no incentive to use your weapons when you have a wrench that does a pretty good job handling enemies. The later games in the series make it so you never ever want to use your wrench, so going back to where there's not many reasons to use your weapons is a bit odd. But the thing is, it's not even really a complaint because it's still a ton of fun to blow up your enemies. It just would have been nice if there was some sort of incentive to use them over your wrench. You have a handful of gadgets that help you along your pathway too, like a swing shot, grind boots, magna boots, and just a bunch of different upgrades that open up pathways in previously explored planets. One of which is the Trespasser, which provides a door unlocking minigame, another staple in the series. One of the big appeals for this series is using a bunch of wacky gadgets and weapons to make you the most powerful creature in the galaxy, and while it's not as prominent in this first game, it's still a ton of fun. As I said before, each planet tells its own story, and a lot of that actually influences the gameplay. You're introduced to a ton of fun new gameplay mechanics constantly, which is always the sign of a great platformer. There's the hoverboard races, a few dogfights, you control an oversized Clank at one point, and more subtle things like being given a turret, and a planet later on that requires you to play as Ratchet without Clank, providing a segment that's actually pure platforming. There's even a few sections where you play as just Clank, who harnesses his inner Captain Olimar and controls a few mini-robots to help clear his pathway. Things are rarely ever boring in the Ratchet & Clank universe. The planets also have gold bolts hidden throughout them, and these are really the only collectible in the game. There are 40 in total, and I'll talk about what they unlock in just a bit. And then a feature returning from Spyro, the skill points are back, which reward you for doing special things within planets. Now I do kinda like these things in concept, but I still just can't bring myself to care too much because there's not a great incentive to get them all, I feel. The reward you get just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. I do kind of feel like just going for them after all this time just to get it over with, but really, just like Spyro 2 and 3, I really just don't think the skill points are that big of a deal. But finally, one of the coolest parts of the entire series is that once you beat the game, you have the option to play through again in New Game Plus, keeping the weapons that you already bought and making it easier to go back and buy weapons you still need. And with the gold bolts that you find, along with a bunch of regular bolts, you're able to buy gold weapon upgrades, making them more powerful. Like the blaster can shoot bouncing bullets, and the bomb glove's explosives are a lot larger. It really is just a great incentive to get all of them because then it makes blowing up your enemies so much easier and so much more satisfying. But of course, I couldn't not mention the biggest reason to replay the game for more bolts. There's a special weapon in the game called the Rhino. The Rip Ya a New One. It's one of those types of weapons that you only hear stories about and how it's one of the most devastating firearms in the entire universe. And it gets offered to you for the low price of 150,000 bolts. Now if you were to legit play through the game collecting every bolt in your path, it could take you like 3 or 4 playthroughs at least. So luckily there's actually a glitch that allows you to enter a race without a board and get a bunch of bolts just by holding down a button. I wouldn't normally mention a glitch like this, but the thing is, the later games make it really easy to get a ton of bolts. This one does not. Frankly, this glitch is just saving you guys from a lot of tedium. Now, one of the best things about Ratchet & Clank is its style. The game is nearly 11 years old, and graphically, it still looks so good. Futuristic is such an open canvas for ideas, and Insomniac Games nailed it. You explore worlds that are just filled in with a ton of wacky characters, you have anthropomorphic fictional animals and robots living together, and tons of flying vehicles. They also balance industrial and natural locales excellently. And man, Insomniac knew they were doing good. Every time you start off on a new planet, the camera conveniently shows you an excellent shot of the world you're about to go into. Frickin' genius. Then there's the soundtrack, which is actually really unique. The music isn't necessarily catchy and I'll be able to hum it later on sense, but in the sense of when you listen to it, you know it's a Ratchet song. In that regard, it's surprisingly similar to the Spyro soundtracks. Really, the entire Ratchet & Clank package feels like something the Spyro the Dragon team would come up with, and for me, that's an easy hook. And as far as negatives go, there really isn't much I can say that didn't end up just being improved in the sequel. Like in this debut game, you don't pause when you scroll through weapons, when you throw your wrench you can't move until it comes back. Things are just slower and not as streamlined as in the sequels. But given these are typical first game in a series issues, I feel like I can't really knock the game because of it, because it's still a lot of fun. There is one issue though that annoys me, and it's that there's no legit strafing. And for a weapon-heavy game, that is a problem. You technically can strafe, but it's just dumb. Rayman 2 on the N64 had strafing, so there's no reason Ratchet had to be so weird about it. This is also something that was improved in the sequels, but this is the one thing that's actually an annoyance. But that's really all I can say that's negative, besides like, it's not as addictive as the sequels. Ratchet & Clank is a really awesome intergalactic adventure with a really good story, great characters, a ton of fun just blowing stuff up, and really it's a platformer like no other. It kickstarted Insomniac's PS2 life in a great way, and it's definitely a must-play. You may notice though that the footage is not from the PS3's Ratchet & Clank collection, rather from the PS2 version. From what I understand, the team behind the collection botched it up quite a bit with a bunch of visual glitches and whatnot, so I haven't picked it up yet. But if you don't mind that, and you just want the game in HD with proper widescreen and trophy support, go for it. But you should probably go for it cheap, because really, how can you botch a collection? For now, I'll just stick with my non-botched PS2 version. Thank you very much. But that leads us to the end of Ratchet and Clank, so next time, we're gonna take a look at the sequel, Going Commando. Such a good name. Hope you guys enjoyed the review, and thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch y'all next time.
Geronimo!
Did he just slide down a sewer pipe?